Jeanna, what could we learn about the pause or the patience that the Fed has that might be different from, the patience it's had before when we get the minutes tomorrow?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting and illuminating set of minutes because I don't think we have a lot of comprehensive understanding of what happened at this January meeting. There was this big pivot coming out of this meeting where we went from expecting 2 rate hikes this year to being really uncertain whether they're expecting any. All we know is that they're waiting to see what happens. And it's not clear to me as a Fed watcher, as someone who's following these folks around and hearing them talk, whether there's much consensus around what happens next. I think it's going to be really interesting to see in these minutes whether there is any signal at a consensus there. Whether they're saying this is 6 months and then we need to see how things play out, but then we'll get right back on schedule. We could get some hints there. I doubt it's going to be that obvious, but I think any details are going to be very much welcome by markets because, it's not just economists and careful Fed watchers who are extremely uncertain about this. I think it's investors, it's everybody right now.
Jeanna, are we going to find out whether or not it was concerns about the US economy or the global economy that caused the Fed to pivot?
I think there's probably going to be a lot of detail about both. What we've seen in the last several sets of minutes is sort of a pretty detailed discussion about risks to the domestic economy, but also about risks emanating from abroad. And certainly what we've heard in Fed speak in recent weeks is this real focus on risks from China, from Europe, from sort of the weakness we've seen in the German data and the uncertainties we've seen around Brexit. Those all seem to be very front of mind for the Fed.
It feels like Fed watchers are trying to figure out how to analyze this new style of communications, right? We were getting so much more communication, and yet it's not exactly clear that things are more obvious. What will we learn about the balance sheet, for example? Because we couldn't possibly have heard any more about it, and yet we're still looking for more details.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be really interesting, actually, to read the balance sheet discussion in these minutes. The Fed has historically used these minutes as a way to convey extra detail about the balance sheet that they're not sure exactly how they're going to convey in speech. We've seen in the last several sets of minutes really detailed discussion of what they're saying about the balance sheet. And so we saw a little bit more of that in the press conference with Jay Powell. He obviously talked about it, but I'm going to be really curious to see, whether this idea of tapering off reinvestments comes up in the minutes. I think that would be really notable, or whether this idea of stopping sometime this year even comes up. There are some economists looking out for that. So lots to watch, lots of moving parts in these ones.
Jeanna, who are we listening to right now? Who are the main voices that you're paying attention to? Clarida speaks on Friday. He would seem like an obvious one.
Absolutely. So I would say Rich Clarida is the one that I'm primarily focused on right now because I think a lot of what we've seen is focused on inflation expectations and inflation and the fact that both have drifted downward. I think that's been one of the things that's really surprised the Fed. And Rich Clarida has this long research record, long before he was at the Fed, of focusing really intently on that specific area of the Fed's policy. I'm also really attuned to John Williams, always, because he is just a thought leader at the Fed and has been for a long time. And now he's a member of that sort of key troika of policymakers. As the New York Fed president, he talks closely with Fed Vice Chair Clarida and Fed Chair Jerome Powell about policy. That's sort of been the historical relationship there, and it seems like they're upholding it. So I would say those two are really the ones to watch, and we're hearing from both of them this week.